Police in Las Vegas found themselves in the middle of a UFO mystery last month after
It ran across the yard.
To us, big eyes. They have big eyes.
911, what are you reporting?
We got someone or something crawling around out here.
Did you see what it was? Was it a person or an animal? Or?
One of my partners said they saw something fall out of the sky too, so that's why I'm kind of curious.
What? I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yeah, I'm looking right at him.
Okay, hang on.
He's right.
Is he in your yard, sir?
Yeah, God, he's big.
Okay, what's he doing in your yard?
Mythical Legends Podcast with your host Daniel Barnett.
Welcome everyone to the Mythical Legends Podcast. We're going to have another great evening with some very exciting topics that are going to come up in today's interview that I've never had on the podcast. But before we go into who we have as a guest today, we have a brand new co-host who's going to be hosting with us for the next few podcasts. Now, this man is a best friend of mine. He's a Bigfoot researcher and in a team here called the UK BRT. We are both co-founders. So we'll have a bit of chat, so I'm going to welcome Chris Alsford. Hey,
Hi there.
Hey buddy, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, and you?
I'm very well. So, Chris, we have an amazing guest, don't we, today?
Oh, yes.
And we have some very good topics, don't we?
It looks like we have a long list. I don't think we have enough time to touch on them, but
No, we don't.
let's do the best we can.
Yeah, amazing. So, we have another amazing guest, adventurer and outdoorsman, just in search for the unknown. Please welcome Aleksandar Pentakov. Hi, Alex. How are you?
Good. Thank you, Daniel and Chris, for having me on, guys. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Pleasure's ours.
You're very welcome, mate. I'm very looking forward to this one. Now, I've looked at your bio and gone, yeah, we ain't gonna fit all this in one interview.
That usually happens.
Yeah, because we only have about 45 minutes, and this is gonna take way longer than that.
I talk a lot too, so it may be difficult to get through some of it.
So I'm jump straight in there, mate, and go with what started your interest in the cryptid world?
I've just always been interested in mysteries since I was young. I was told the story of the Yeti in the Himalayas, and I always grew up reading some of that stuff. I grew up in the 1990s, so it was the time when X-Files, the show, was big. I grew up watching Monster Quest, some of the classics In Search Of. I read a lot of Lauren Coleman and many of the other cryptozoologists, and this was a time before social media, so I remember when the internet was first coming about, I would read a lot of blogs. So it was Lauren Coleman, Cryptomundo, some of these other sites. And I've always been a fan of adventure. I was actually born in South Africa. My parents had went there after their home country of Yugoslavia had fallen apart due to civil war. And I was born in South Africa, and I was only a few years old when I moved to the U.S., so I don't remember much. But I remember these stories my parents told me about biking on the border of Zambia with elephants and going to the Drakensberg Mountains in search of 10,000-year-old Bushman paintings in the mountains as my mom was pregnant with me. So I grew up with all these stories, my dad needing to nearly fight a baboon who was trying to steal me as a baby. So there's all these stories I grew up with of Africa, right? It was just amazing. So I've always wanted to kind of make my own adventures and tell my own stories and have something like that to pass down to my family one day. So I think my love of the outdoors and my love of mysteries have just combined into a general interest for cryptids like Bigfoot and many of the other topics.
It sounds like a very interesting life, mate.
An interesting start.
Yes.
I can tell you, Alex, I noticed from your biopic that you were in Polokwane, and I spent a couple of years there.
Wow,
I can tell you it's still just as wild, just as beautiful, and just as amazing still today. So
Well, it's funny because I was born, so Polokwane, the time I was born there, it was called Petersburg, and it's been changed since. But when I was born there, my family, actually, my parents were not living there. That was just the nearest kind of hospital. But my dad was actually a doctor at a Swiss missionary hospital in an area even further north of Polokwane called Louis Treehart. And we were out kind of in the bush. We lived in a house, and we had all kinds of animals and monkeys on the roof, and lizards as pets that were living in the walls. That was kind of the funny stories I heard growing up. So it was very wild. Again, I have all these family photo albums looking through all the pictures, and my parents talking about going to all the neighboring countries and visiting Lesotho and all these other little places in South Africa. So I've been back once since when I was about 2014, 2015. So it was about 20 years since I left. So it was interesting to see South Africa, and what a beautiful, gorgeous place it is. Of course, it has a lot of social problems, but it's somewhat dangerous. But we went on safari. We did a lot of the kind of typical stuff you do there. But it's a fascinating place. So as I'm sure you know, having been there, it's unreal.
So I'm really, really excited to know more about this. Excuse me. This topic, because I've never had this on the podcast, and my dad has said, and other viewers have said that we really, really need to get this topic explained. So, without further ado, could you tell us a bit about your work to do with the Loch Ness monster?
Yes, Loch Ness Monster, as many are fans of course, that topic. One of the most famous cryptids in the world, of course. Bigfoot probably is the only one above that, I would say, in terms of notoriety. Loch Ness has been around for a long time. I was always curious in the stories. So when I actually got out of school in about 2015, as I mentioned, with family heritage in the former Yugoslavia, I would spend time there growing up and visiting. So I went after I graduated, spent some time over there, and going from Croatia or Serbia to Scotland is not that far of a flight. It's only a few hours realistically. And back then, flights were pretty cheap. So I went on a trip to Scotland, of course, with the intention of going to Loch Ness. So I spent a few days at Loch Ness and just did a little short documentary on it. I can't even watch it anymore because it's something that I did almost a decade ago at this point, and it's come a long way since then, I'll put it that way. But I did this short film on Loch Ness. It was my first ever documentary on a cryptid. I always thought to myself, well, I've spent my childhood reading about this stuff and interested in it. Why don't I try to add my own spin, and did a short film on it. And that kind of then propelled me into other directions, doing stuff on the Lake Champlain monster, and of course Bigfoot, stuff that we have here in the U.S. But I loved being able to go to Loch Ness. But I will say, after a lot of people, it's kind of one of those things, don't meet your heroes sort of thing. After looking more into the Loch Ness, I actually became a little more skeptical of Loch Ness itself, believe it or not. I just thought, because of the learning about the biology of the lake, how it's actually not very conducive for a lot of species of fish. It's very deep, it's got a lot of that peat kind of build up. So I thought, whatever this thing is, maybe it is extinct. I know there's some line of thinking on those lines. I know there's been recent sightings, but it seems like it also is a little bit of an incentive for tourism there, because the monster is a big draw to Scotland in Loch Ness. And what I learned was, in the years following that, being involved in looking at the Lake Champlain mystery here in the United States, which is funny because that's virtually 3 hours from me, 3 hours from where I grew up. And I was always more interested in Loch Ness across the ocean, right? Not Lake Champlain, which was basically in my backyard. And I think the Lake Champlain monster story is very underrated, especially when compared to Nessie. And I learned so much about Lake Champlain. Lake Champlain itself is 123 miles long, almost 12 miles wide at the widest, 420 plus feet deep at the deepest. It's one of the most biodiverse lakes in North America, actually. It's one of the 20 largest, I believe. It's got almost 90 plus species of fish, extremely conducive, lots of very large sturgeon and other fish in the lake, compared to Loch Ness, which I believe is only about, I haven't looked at the statistics in a while, but it's either 12 or 24 miles long. I'm not sure which one it is, but it's a lot smaller than Lake Champlain. Maybe Chris or Daniel.
You're about right there, I think. Yeah, it's 23 miles long from memory. Yeah.
Right. It's not small by any means. It's only about a few miles wide at the widest, but it's dwarfed by Lake Champlain. And I found that with Lake Champlain, because it's a place that's bordering the U.S. states of Vermont and New York, and it juts into the province of Quebec in Canada a little bit, just the northern part. But people don't go there looking for the monster. It's not very well known. So the stories are, dare I say, a little more underground than perhaps Nessie, which is a little more on the nose. As I said, you go to a place like Loch Ness, and there's Nessie paraphernalia everywhere, and you can buy souvenirs, and there's museums, and nothing wrong with that at all. I love the idea of cryptid tourism, but that doesn't virtually exist at Lake Champlain in Vermont. I mean, there's a few shops that'll sell some souvenirs and some plaques, but the average person going to Lake Champlain might not even know there is a monster. They just go because it's a world-class fishing destination, boating. People have lake houses there, summer camps. It's just a massive, massive lake. As I said, almost 24 miles long. I mean, it's enormous. So from one end to the next, I mean, you're traveling almost 3+ hours from north to south. And the southern point ends in Whitehall, New York, which is kind of considered to be the East Coast Bigfoot capital because it's now very well known for the famous Abear Road incident in the 1970s involving multiple law enforcement agencies with some Sasquatch sightings, and that's right at the southern tip of the lake. So it's very interesting how it's an area where you have this convergence of folklore between Champ and Bigfoot-like stories on the East Coast. So yeah, Loch Ness, I still love it. It's still got a special place in my heart. But I think, we've been looking at that lake for so long, for over a century now, or around a century at this point, I should say. I haven't gotten there quite yet. In the 2030s, I believe it'll be about a century. But I think if something was maybe living there, maybe it's extinct, or maybe, I mean, I find it hard to believe it might be able to travel to and from the ocean. And I know this probably sounds like I'm a downer, but, this is my honest thoughts about having looked into it. And I don't try to sugarcoat what I felt about sort of the experience, but I mean, what a stunningly beautiful place Loch Ness is, with so much history and the castle there. It's an incredible location. I
can give you a little hope if you like, Alex.
Sure.
So I followed pretty much the same line of thought when I went there. The access into the ocean is very narrow and shallow. It would be some feet for some creature to get in there.
Inverness.
Yeah. But I also, as we follow all these sort of things, we pick up bits of information. Sharks, great white sharks, they don't actually get pregnant until they're 34, 36 years old. And then salmon return to their spawning ground to give birth. And you kind of have this hope, maybe there's like a 40-year cycle. And when you look at Loch Ness, the first report of it back in 694 AD, I'm sure somebody's going to tell me I've got the wrong date, but it's a 1400-year-old legend.
Right.
And this, so it gives me hope. It gives me some hope that it's there.
There is something too about these northern lakes. I mean, Loch Ness is on a very similar latitude as Lake Champlain is, as is Lake Okanagan in British Columbia. A lot of these lakes have these northern lakes, glacial lakes often. Many of these, I mean, as Loch Ness and Lake Champlain were both the result of glaciers. So it's very interesting and how that kind of formed the landscape and receded, connected to the ocean at one point. Even in Lake Champlain, at the point now, there is no way for anything to get in and out of the lake because there's elevation changes and there's many of the locks similar to what might be found in the Caledonian Canal, perhaps going south from Loch Ness, connecting it to the other locks. But Lake Champlain, you exit down towards New York City in the Hudson River, but there's a lot of changes. And then up through the Richelieu River, it goes to the St. Lawrence Seaway. But Lake Champlain was part of the ocean as recently as 15 to 10,000 years ago, possibly. And we know that there were beluga whales and other aquatic species of mammal and fish that lived in that lake. So the idea is maybe something managed to adapt or survive. I don't know, but I have heard some of the theories about that cyclical nature with a place like Loch Ness. I guess that's more of what my point was. It seemed like a resident population would be, he's got the map. A resident population might be difficult, right? But yeah, maybe there is a cyclical nature. I don't know. I mean, I haven't looked into it a whole lot since. I know people who do look into it, some people in the UK, and I've seen what Ken Gerhardt and others have done. I know there was recently a very big Nessie kind of search and hunt, which I think is great, using some of the more modern technology, which is awesome. But
And I'll jump in right there and go, it was eDNA, environmental
Yes.
DNA that did
Right.
that. And I don't know if you know about mine that I
I've
did.
heard about it, yes, Mike, and I've heard it from others as well.
I'll go into that when we go into Bigfoot later. But I think when you come to Loch Ness and Bigfoot here in the UK, if you go up to someone and say Loch Ness monster, they will know what you're talking about, and they'll go, "Oh, I know this, this, and this." When you go up to someone and say Bigfoot, they'll laugh at you and go, "Number one, that's a cartoon." They'll say,
Right.
and it goes on like that. But my opinion is, it's good to have a healthy amount of debunking your number one, your own stuff, and other things that are around. Because if you don't debunk what you find, then you're never kind of gonna push on with what. And when you've said about Loch Ness, I think you're totally right on that. Where it's now, I've been close to it, but I don't know. And I don't know enough about it to kind of make an opinion. But I think I completely agree with you on that. Where it's an I don't know now.
Right.
Yeah. And it's but a very, very interesting story. I'll say that.
Yeah, and like I said, that's just my personal kind of takeaways, and I haven't been very involved in the Loch Ness scene in a while. I just know people who are, like I said, Ken, and people like Steve Feltham. I follow his Facebook page. I got to meet him when I was there at Loch Ness, and I did a short interview with him as well for my short film. So it's interesting to see what's going on. And as we talked about, it's one of the most popular cryptids really in the world. So. And there's that famous term, the road to Loch Ness, which used by academia to kind of describe once you start heading down that path, it's usually not a good thing, especially if you're an academic, right? A scientist or a paleontologist or something along those lines. So it's interesting, but lake monsters immensely fascinating. As I said, Lake Champlain become one of my favorite cryptids to look into just because of the history there and the interesting kind of underrated nature of that lake. Whether or not there is a creature or not, there has been just centuries of history. I mean, from alleged Native American legends of a snake-like creature in the water to the 1800s. I mean, you had a serpent craze in which people were seeing large serpent-like creatures in the lake, and even famous showman P.T. Barnum put up a very substantial bounty at the time for the capture of the Lake Champlain sea serpent, as they called it, in the late 1800s, dead or alive. And there were hunting parties that went out to try and capture the beast. So, and it also there seems to be a cyclical nature in the sightings at Lake Champlain. Every 20, 30 years, there will be an uptick. And then there's more of a media attention on it. And then you have things like the Sandra Mancy photo that came out in the early 1980s. That was from the late 1970s. That has never really been debunked. I know there's a lot of theories, and I actually was fortunate enough to be one of the last to speak to Sandra before she passed away a few years ago when I was working on my Champ series. And I don't think she hoaxed anything. I don't think her family was involved in creating a hoax of a plesiosaur-like looking head sticking out of the water. Whether or not that was a real creature, I can't say, of course. But she seemed sincere in the fact that they didn't actually... I mean, at the time, it wasn't as easy as it is now. Now I can type in an AI program and create a lake monster image, right? Back then, you actually had to physically put something into the water to hoax, so it was a little more impractical. But that photo, unlike the surgeon's photo, has never been alleged to be, a deathbed confession that it was fake or anything like that. So, yeah, I think it's a very interesting story. I mean, recently I was in British Columbia too, and of course there's Ogopogo, and there are these stories around the world of strange lake monsters. So I'm very fascinated because I think water is one of those places we just don't really understand. A lot of people have a visceral fear of water, especially deep, dark, murky water. You think of the movie Jaws, of course, and the imprint that's left on our psyche. People even in swimming pools get nervous with a shark coming at them. So I think it makes sense why we're interested in the things that are beneath the surface. We can't really That's not our world, right? We have to use all this
Yeah.
specialized equipment just to get underwater and be able to survive. I mean, it'll kill us if we're under there without any equipment or a submarine or anything. So it's very fascinating. I think that's why we have such an interest in the oceans and lakes and mysteries that come from the water.
And I think there's more to come because we haven't actually got down to the bottom of the ocean yet. So there is still more to kind of discover, which might put more info. We don't know. I'm gonna jump
Absolutely.
right into the big, probably one of the biggest in the world. I'll say is Bigfoot.
Yes.
Now I gotta say it's my favorite one.
Yeah.
Now it's just So why don't you go ahead and tell us about your work on Bigfoot, bud?
Sure. Yeah, I always say Champ is one of my favorite cryptids, the idea of it, right? But Bigfoot is my favorite to actually search for because it takes you to so many incredible places, right? So, as I mentioned, I've always been interested in mystery hominids, Bigfoot-like creatures, the Yeti, of course, in the Himalayas, those classic stories. But here in North America, having grown up in the United States, we have such a rich history of strange sightings, and just the amount of wilderness in this country and throughout Canada as well is just, it's staggering. It's actually hard for people to believe. So I've always been interested in it here in the New England region. We have quite a bit of stories here too, especially in northern New Hampshire and into Maine. So this area, to put into perspective, New Hampshire is one of the smaller states, but it's actually the second most forested by percentage of forests. I mean, it's almost 90% forested. And number one most forested state in the U.S. is neighboring Maine, which is just our northern neighbor. And both states have just a population just over 1 million, which is really not much for the space. Maine is estimated to have up to 50 to 70,000 moose, which are the largest basically land animal in North America, aside from maybe some brown bears in Alaska. But Maine has the most amount of moose anywhere outside of Alaska in the U.S., right? So 30,000 black bear. We have thousands of moose here in New Hampshire. So that my point is these habitats support these large animals. I mean, you go to parts of Maine and you have a very high chance of seeing more moose than deer even. And these are animals that can get up to 800 to 1,000 pounds. I mean, they're very large animals. So we're in the northern Appalachians here. So this is the northern end of the Appalachian mountain chain, which goes all the way down into Georgia and kind of the foothills in Alabama and all throughout kind of the East Coast. And that was the former boundary of the U.S., right? When it was the original colonies and before early kind of statehood or early nationhood for the United States, that was the frontier. A lot of the credible sightings of Bigfoot tend to come from this kind of region, right? At least on the East Coast. So we have a history of it here in the New England area, Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, some parts of Massachusetts. But like I said, very high forestation, low population, very rugged terrain. We do have some mountains. I mean, they're nothing compared to maybe the mountains in Colorado, the Rockies, or the Cascades out in the Pacific Northwest, or certainly Alaska. But they're still very rugged. People are surprised how Mount Washington in New Hampshire has some of the worst weather in the world. I mean, it's claimed hundreds of lives for people that are unprepared hiking, and it's only a 6,000 plus foot mountain. But you have an alpine zone, and it's a very kind of rough terrain. I've hiked a lot of it. So I was always interested in the stories around here. But over the past few years, I've been lucky enough to do a series called Bigfoot Beyond the Trail with Small Town Monsters, which I've been able to travel virtually all across North America. I mean, we've been into Canada at this point. I can't even remember off the top of my head the amount of locations, but everywhere from the Everglades in Florida and these subtropical kind of swamplands down south to the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Northwest rainforest, the Redwoods, Bluff Creek, West Virginia, Alaska, British Columbia, all these places. So we've been able to go to these locations and explore them and spend some time there. And it just has been incredible. I mean, I drove up to Alaska from the East Coast this past summer, which was a 10,000 plus mile round trip journey. And I spent a month up in Alaska. And just that terrain along the way when you're driving through Canada, you have the Alaska Highway, which goes through northern British Columbia and the Yukon into Alaska. Virtually one of the most remote places on Earth to this day. And you just have a highway cutting through. And on either side of the highway, you could essentially disappear forever and never be seen again with the amount of space that is still out there in the boreal forests that are up there. So you see that, and it kind of makes sense. Something could still be out there hiding in some of these remote areas, or even on the edges of civilization that butt up against these remote areas, because that's where a lot of the reports come from. Typically towns that are somewhat close to wilderness areas or right on the edge of civilization, because you need, of course, a person to have a Sasquatch sighting, right? If they're just living in the middle of absolute nowhere and people never go there, I mean, you're not going to know it. So we need people to have reports in order to kind of get that sort of those anecdotal stories. So yeah, I've been very fortunate to be able to do this series and really look into cases that I personally want to. I mean, it's all my own interests. I've done stuff here locally with that because, of course, that's an area I focused on prior to that. But now, since about 2021, our focus has been really around the country and around North America. So it's been a little overwhelming at times, but it's so fascinating because you get to go see places like Alaska and talk to researchers in those areas and witnesses and people, because I'm not going to go to the swamps of Louisiana and assume I know anything. I don't. I grew up here in the temperate forests up here in the deciduous forests of northern New England. That's a world away from Louisiana, where you have alligators and poisonous snakes and all these other creatures that I'm not used to dealing with. So I want to talk to locals. I want to talk to those Cajuns who live down there and people who have experiences with something they can't explain. So yeah, it's been incredible. It's been nothing short of amazing, and the series has had quite a bit of success online, which I'm of course very thankful for. But I've gotten so many people that have been inspired to go out and just enjoy nature or go out on their own and try their own investigations. And I think that's great, especially in a day and age where we're so surrounded by technology and the world is somewhat getting smaller in the sense that everything is getting urban and suburban. I think it's great that people are still trying to connect with nature. I think it's a good thing to try to encourage that, because that's something I think we're losing in a lot of ways.
And I can definitely say, Alex, that is my goal. And I don't know if you know, but I put on a convention, I would say, and the secondary meaning is to get children out into the forest, out looking and out just away from TV. And I would say during the summer I was out probably every weekend, and we were out in the forest, and it's been very, very lovely. I'll say that. Confusing and unknown. I'll say that. But it's been amazing. I would like to get your opinion on what you think of my finding. Do you know a decent amount about what we found?
I wouldn't say a decent. I would say I've just kind of heard a little bit through the grapevine, through Mike Ann and some of those folks.
It was, about 10, 11 weeks ago now, where we first found, thank you. We found a 18-inch indentation. And when you come across an 18-inch indentation, what do you do with toe
3D scan
it. We casted it, and we took some eDNA.
That's awesome.
And surprisingly, it came back as Old World Monkey and Grey Ape. And since then, we found bones. We found scat that looks like bear, and we have no predators here at all known. I'll say that. And we found carcasses, structures. What are your thoughts on that here in the UK?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I'm typically a little skeptical of UK kind of Bigfoot stories, if it's a strictly kind of flesh and blood creature, because of course I would think that it would make sense in a place like North America or maybe other parts of the world, in Asia and whatnot. Obviously, some people are more on the paranormal side of things. Then you don't know. I mean, I guess the possibilities are endless at that point. I know the UK has a big, I don't want to say problem, but issue with escaped animals and possible sort of illicit trade with exotic animals. That's something with the big cat topic that I've heard quite a bit about. The black beast of Exmoor and other places where obviously the UK is not supposed to have black panther or big cat like creatures, right? They're not native to the land, yet people are reporting
we are definitely going to touch on that very, very shortly.
Right. So it's interesting because from what I understand, and I've spent a little bit of time in the UK, but never really in the wilderness. I've been to Oxford and London and that sort of thing, and Scotland, of course. So I haven't spent a lot of time. I've just seen some of the wild places in Scotland. But there does seem to be a good amount of forest land. I've heard of the stories of the Grey Man of Ben Macdui up there, which I think is some kind of a light phenomena where in the fog your own shadow almost looks like something following you, which I find really interesting, kind of a folklore around that. But yeah, I don't know what to make of it, honestly. And I'm not a scientist, so I don't pretend to know eDNA stuff. Whenever I get anything remotely interesting, whether it's hair samples or anything like that, I make sure to talk to people. Oftentimes some that, Amy Boo might be able to help me connect with, people who know what they're doing. And I've tried to do some eDNA stuff on my own that way. So I don't know how to interpret any of that kind of stuff. I'm decent in the woods enough, just in terms of the outdoorsman aspect, tracking and that sort of stuff. But I'm not a scientist by any means, so I don't know how I'd be able to interpret results like that. I know eDNA is still a very complicated topic. I know even just a few years ago, some of the stuff that sounds like what you were doing, where you were sampling directly from, footprint, that wasn't even really available, at least to just a common person, even a few years ago. We tried to focus on water eDNA, which I think is another avenue that a lot of people look at, collecting a water sample that could contain certain bacteria or fecal samples or something that shows that there's creatures in the environment, as we talked about with Loch Ness. That would have been, one way to kind of see, hey, what is living in this lake? So I don't know a whole lot about it, obviously. So I genuinely can't, interpret some of that stuff as well as maybe a scientist would. So I'd have to say, if I knew what I was talking about, I'd probably be able to give you a better answer. If that's sort of a cop-out, I guess. But I don't know what to make of it,
Well, Alex, join the club. None of us.
Right.
None of us. No.
And I think that's great. As long as we can admit, like, hey, this is strange, but we don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
And it's great to talk with those people that do have those skill sets, of course. And I can't confirm this yet, but I'm getting my info from Dr. Jeffrey Maldron to see what he thinks. See, that's great. That's what I love about this kind of topic, is being able to connect with those people that bring so many different skill sets or have credentials behind them, just to be able to help out. I mean, you could be not, let's say you're not looking at Bigfoot, but you're just trying to figure out what attacked your horse on your property, right? Maybe it was a wolf or something. You live in Montana, it was a mountain lion. You're probably going to be talking to those sorts of people anyway. You're not going to be assuming you know how to interpret that. So I think being able to pass that off to the right people is a great way to just gain a little bit of knowledge about that.
Yeah, and it's definitely interesting.
That's fascinating. I mean, and I don't know what old world monkey. I mean, I'm assuming that's non-South American monkeys, which would be the New World, right? Which would be things like howler monkeys, because we're not supposed to have any apes or monkeys in North America, right? But South America does, South and Central America. So I would assume old world is probably anything that's not New World. At least
I know
that
that we did have a population of old world monkey. I know that.
Interesting.
But ages ago. I mean,
that would have been a long time ago.
And apart from us, there are no primates in the UK.
Or at least there shouldn't be, as we're told, right?
Shouldn't be.
Shouldn't be, no. And and it's just really odd. And all the researchers here in the UK, a lot of the researchers in America have no clue what this is. No clue. And I've not said it's Bigfoot yet. I've not said it's anything yet.
Sure.
And I won't until I know a definitive answer. And in some way, I want it to kind of be debunked, really,
That's a
because
great way to look at
then
it. Yeah.
you've got, you know what it is, and also what is causing old world monkey DNA here in the UK. And that could be potentially a new discovery in many different ways. It's just very, very odd that it came in an 18-inch footprint with toe indentations near something that looks like bear scat and bones and structures. That's weird.
That's strange. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great attitude you have, though, about, a lot of people, unfortunately, when they do get some kind of alleged evidence, right, they, and I've seen this time and time again, being involved in this topic, people get emotionally attached to their findings, right? Which means that you can't be unbiased when you're dealing with it. People often get defensive when they're asked tough questions, but I always say, if you have some alleged evidence, it should be able to withstand the scrutiny, and you should be able to and be open to presenting it to a variety of people. Say, hey, here, please debunk it. I've always said that with some of the stuff I've found, and I've been happy to know we found hair samples that turned out to be raccoon. I'm totally fine with that. It's all in the right context, right? Oh, it was found in an area with potential Bigfoot activity. It was high up in a fence, so we think maybe this thing got nicked by hair. It turns out to be a raccoon. So as long as you're open to that and, willing to have that dialogue, I think that's great. And talk to people that are skeptical and people that, just are not attached to the evidence, because you're getting even if it's a friend or somebody that's maybe got a little bit more of an objective, just say, hey, take a look at this for me. What do you think of this? Just don't sugarcoat it. Tell me what you think. There's no need to kind of, just because you're my friend, I want you to kind of, this is what I really think. And I think that's great. Fortunately, a lot of people can't take that the right way, but I think it's great to want to debunk your own work, because once you debunk things and work away from the possibilities, you can narrow down what it might or might not be.
And when you open a package, when it comes that says Bigfoot eDNA from the SGS, you go, okay, have you, and the scientists there, now obviously scientists are scientists and they will go by what science is, and this who did the eDNA went, holy crap, the kid may have actually done it. And for a scientist to actually say that, it could potentially go, is there something else that we're missing? But it's a very, very, very interesting find. I'll say that.
Definitely, yeah. I'd say keep your arms open for other interpretations and any kind of stuff, and just like you said, talking to people like Meldrum and others as well who just are involved, and that's what they do. They're trained in that, scientifically trained. I think is great to talk with those people.
Amazing. So now Chris, did you all say something?
I was going to ask Alex, still on the Bigfoot thing, the famous tree structure, the famous one that everybody goes to. You guys went there in the first episode you did, and I'm not sure exactly where it is, to be honest.
Which one?
It's just off the trail. I think there may have been a burnt out caravan. It may have been when you were there or Justin Cherpaninsky went there. And they got the big tree structure up on the side of the hill.
Oh, I don't recall. I mean, we found alleged structures, but I don't know if it's a specific one.
Okay. When you're actually in there looking at these tree structures, big ones, something that's beyond the capability of your average human being, what kind of, you get any sort of primeval feelings inside, any raised elevated heartbeat, anything that makes you, something from our prehistory that wakes up inside, makes you start looking over your shoulder a bit more, or more alert?
Yeah, I've never had that happen specifically around tree structures. There's been a few times out in the woods where you get that really stereotypical, I feel like I'm being watched feeling. That's really kind of unusual in an area here in New Hampshire where there's been kind of a history of alleged Bigfoot activity. was out there once with a friend one night, and this is an area I would go to pretty frequently. It was sort of a regular kind of area I would visit and kind of do amateur research and just try out different experiments and that sort of thing. But we were out there one night, and this was probably the most tangible I've ever felt this feeling. It's just so weird. We found there's this strange structure thing. I don't know what it is. I mean, it's just a bunch of weird trees, and I'm not saying it's anything related to Bigfoot or otherwise. It could just be random blowdown kind of thing. Here in New England, we get really harsh winters, so snow load and bears can climb into saplings and snap them in weird ways. So again, I'm pretty skeptical about a lot of the structure stuff, but we find this kind of structure. I've known about it. We're hiking around at night, and we start walking back, and I get this, again, the most tangible I've ever felt, the feeling of this tingling, you're being watched. And I'm thinking that in my head, man, it feels like I'm being watched. And my friend walking next to me, same exact moment, just verbally says, dude, I think we're being watched. And I turned to him and I said, what are you talking Like, how did you just read my mind? I mean, my mind was blown, right? I couldn't believe it. And he said, no, I just have this weird feeling. I said, I have the same exact feeling, but you just expressed verbally what I was thinking. I mean, that is one of those, how do you explain that kind of thing? Then maybe that is going back to what you said, Chris, these sort of primeval instincts we have. Maybe if there's a predator or something in the area that we just have this kind of feeling. I mean, recently I talked to Les Stroud, Survivor Man, and he talks about being watched. You know, in the wilderness, you're always being watched, right? Yeah. Whether it's small bugs watching you, usually you're not going to kind of acknowledge that or feel that, but you could be watched by a moose or a mountain lion or a distant mountain goat or something, a bear, and you would have no idea. We're probably being watched a lot of the times in the woods, and we have no idea, right? But when you feel it so tangibly, that's what's really interesting. So never had that specifically with structures, but that was a really defining moment. But the only structures that I've seen or that I've kind of been to the area of that I found somewhat fascinating were what the Olympic Project has discovered in the so-called Ness site in the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State. We went out there in 2021, and we were the first to ever really go out there and film and stay overnight in those areas where they discovered almost 26 of these weird kind of gorilla-looking ground nests. I mean, I don't think anyone's ever made the claim that they're specifically of those guys from the Olympic Project, they are Bigfoot nests, but they find them really interesting. That was an area that, you know, when we were there, the nests were somewhat deteriorated, but you could kind of see the general area. And I thought to myself, this is really unusual. I mean, this area is so far off the beaten path. None of the known animals have a very, they're not known to exhibit this kind of behavior in that specific region very much, or at least to what I know. So I found that pretty interesting. But I don't know if I would consider that in the same sort of realm as some of the structures that a lot of other people claim. Here in North America, unfortunately, with the Bigfoot topic, a lot of what you see online I find very hard to believe. People, they make things up. People, wishful thinking. We don't have a lot of facts, so a lot of people will make stuff up, unfortunately. But I've found that as we've become more disconnected from nature, people mistake common things for maybe a structure. But one example I'll give is I used to do some survival training and naturalism training, and we would build shelters. So we would build debris shelters where you basically are taking a tree with a Y formation and putting a stick going kind of right through that Y to the ground and adding ribs to the side, basically lining it with sticks on either side and then covering it with debris. So that's an emergency shelter you can just crawl into, one person. We used to do all sorts of shelters like that, right? And people go and practice their bushcraft and leave it in the woods. I've been shown pictures before of people showing me deteriorated debris shelters and even lean-tos and teepees that people have made and say, oh, this is definitely Bigfoot. I said, I think it's most likely people. And then I look up that specific, to this instance, it was a state park or a state forest, and I looked it up. And you could actually go to the website of that state forest and sign up for bushcrafting classes where some instructor presumably would take you out into the woods and you build these structures. People don't often tear them down. They just leave them there. So I tell this person, hey, this is in the park. And they say, well, this was way off the trail. There's no way people would have gotten to it. Well, where do you think people are building debris shelters, right? They're not building somewhere right on the trail. So, people will believe what they want is what I found. But I think I'm kind of I'm skeptically minded, but I'm also tough to please in terms of alleged evidence and that sort of thing. It has to be very obvious for me in terms of alleged visual evidence and that kind of thing. So the structure thing, it's a hard sell for me, at least in some instances. I've seen stuff, as I mentioned, that's a little weird, like that Olympic project stuff, and some other kind of weird structures that would pop up. But I can't say with a certainty what made them because I didn't see what built them, if it was a person or a bear or weather related. I don't know. I typically tend to be pretty, skeptical and don't like giving definitive answers when I really have no way of establishing how it could have happened.
And I'll jump in there and go, I completely agree with you there. And one of the issues that I face here in the UK with kind of researching here is people tend to build structures, and that's difficult. But you can kind of structures from normal people to then ones that are out of place. And one of the joys that we stand here is, number one, not many people know about Bigfoot, and number two, we don't have bears here, which means I will be fine. I'm not going to be killed by a bear, which I love. There was one structure which I found, and it was 15 feet in the air. Now I go, now what are the chances of someone carrying a ladder up a hill, getting it all the way through as far as it's about a half hour to the spot, up a tree? I go, could happen.
Right. A lot of dedication.
It's just it would take a lot of work to kind of do that. I'm like, it could tip either way. I haven't put all my hopes and dreams into structures, because of the reason you just said. But yeah, I will completely agree there with I find it hard to believe with some structures where it's like I go, no, you can see the cut marks, you can see, and I think some people do it for the joy of going, oh, I found a Bigfoot tree structure. Right.
It's so hard to say because, like, a common one that people hear people will post online about is a bent over tree, or just a small sapling that's been snapped, right? Maybe at 8 foot, 9 foot height, right? Oh, that's well out of the range of human. I've seen some weird ones, right? But there is video evidence, and I've seen this, of bears. You know, you've got a 300-400 pound black bear. That's a big boy climbing into a small sapling that's maybe this wide around. As he gets 8 or 9 feet up, guess what's going to happen? Snaps. I've seen very funny footage of bears going up there. I mean, even one I think was a mother, getting her cubs as they were up in the tree, and it snapped as she went up. So somebody maybe comes across that in the woods and says, "Oh my God, this is 8-9 feet up," right? Unless we saw what happened, it's very hard to establish that. But again, that being said, I have found some strange structures that I have a hard time explaining, but that doesn't mean they couldn't have been. They can't be explained, I should say. So yeah, I think it's an interesting topic, but I tend to think if something is like Bigfoot, if it is some sort of elusive creature, I don't imagine it would be leaving multiple structures in very popular state parks, as some people have assumed, right, where a lot of people go. I mean, you've got even people in suburban and semi-urban areas claiming that creatures are coming in building structures. I mean, once you kind of go down that rabbit hole, you can get lost. People making crazy claims, but yeah, I think it's interesting to look at, and especially when you have stuff like those alleged nests at the Olympic project, if that indeed is even Bigfoot, which we don't know, but if that is, that's very intriguing because that's a sort of behavior that maybe you could try to find in another area too.
So, my next question is going to be possibly an easy one, but I don't know. It's probably the highlight of Bigfoot. What is your opinion on the Patterson Gimlin film?
Ah, very interesting. Yeah, it's a very fascinating piece of footage, of course. I tend to lean towards it being real. Certain day, you ask me which day, and it just seems. How should I put it? Before I went to the Patterson Gimlin site about 2 years ago, we actually slept in the very place where Patty had walked in Bluff Creek in Northern California.
Wow.
Before then, I thought it was very intriguing. There were points where I believed wholeheartedly, points where I didn't. But I think once you go there, it kind of paints the scene a little bit. What I still don't understand is why. So Bluff Creek to this day is very hard to get to. You drive a few hours up into the mountains, and it's not right off the beaten path. You're already in a very remote region of Northern California. Why these guys, if it is a hoax, which I don't know if it is or not, but why would they go so far, so deep into the wilderness to do this level of a hoax when they could have gone a mile or two outside of the town of Willow Creek, hiked a mile into the woods, much closer to the road, much closer to civilization, and filmed it, and you would have had almost a very similar environment, right? It would have been extremely similar in terms of habitat. Why go through all the extra trouble? I mean, I don't know, maybe dedication. I can't speak to that, of course, but going there really kind of illustrated to me this place is, I mean, if there were a place for something like this to be, Bluff Creek to this day is very, very conducive habitat with the different species and everything there. So something also, a few years ago there was a show, and generally I'm not a huge fan of some of the Bigfoot content you see on TV. I think there's a lot of exaggeration and fakery going on, but there was a program, The Truth Is Out There, and they did a kind of composite of the Patterson Gimlin film, and the people who were involved I found to be somewhat trustworthy. So Dr. Jeff Meldrum, of course, somebody who's well known, Bill Munns. Yes, who's done probably some of the most work, and somebody I actually met personally that I think is not really involved very much in the Bigfoot topic, but they're specialized their skill set is Isaac Tian, and I met him with the Olympic Project. He was the one that put together, using different copies of the Patterson Gimlin film. So in the show you have the three of those guys, and all they did was put together, using different copies of the footage, a sort of composite using all these copies of that footage, and it showed movement of body parts. I mean, around the breasts and certain things that were just, I had never seen it in that light before in terms of the movement and some of the leg muscle kind of thing, if that is indeed what we're looking at, that I thought, I mean, this would have been so difficult to fake in the 1960s. I mean, they still can't create that level of suit today. I mean, yes, you can create incredible looking costumes nowadays, but this was 1967 in that remote of a location to have that much movement. So it really, I mean, it leans me towards it being real. But I think whatever, if it's real or not, it doesn't make a difference at this point, because unfortunately, Patterson Gimlin film, it's not going to be enough to prove Bigfoot. We're going to need more hard evidence or multiple instances like the Patterson Gimlin film where you have footage. So I think it's never going to be proven or disproven, because there's always going to be people on either side, right? I think it's extremely fascinating. It's very culturally influential. I mean, all the depictions of Bigfoot have that sort of, that famous pose, right? And it's very influenced by that film. But it's either one of the best hoaxes of all time, or it is absolutely a really good piece of footage. But, my personal opinion aside, I don't think it's going to make a difference. It hasn't. It's been almost 60, 70 years at this point. So we're still talking about it. So I don't think it's going to change the outcome, but it is definitely interesting. If Bigfoot were to be proven tomorrow, I think people would be able to look at the Patterson Gimlin film and say, well, it does show, what is likely a female.
One point that really got me on side. Now I'm autistic. Now it's hard to get me on a mind where I go, yeah, that's real. I have to. I'm not closed mind, but I have to kind of be on one straight line. And the thing that got me was the foot. So when the toes went down, and I go, movement. Yeah,
I know exactly what you're talking about.
I go, so if you're looking at the tiniest details like that, and you go, it's like the back and neck. You got the fur that I go. Now, Chris loves the PG film. I go, is it? On my opinion, it's real. I think there's been enough people look into it and enough small details to go, I can't say for sure.
Right. But you know what's
Obviously.
interesting too? Something that you should try to look for, and it's very hard to find actually. Most people have seen the footage, right? The famous frame where it walks through and it kind of goes past that log. People have seen that plenty. Very few people have actually seen the ending parts of the footage where there's almost a straight on view, especially if stabilized, of Patty walking away. And I've walked the path I was shown by Rowdy Kelly, member of the Bluff Creek Project, then they rediscovered the film site there, I think in 2012 or so, and they were able to find these old stumps and things that are still present. But he took me the path where Patty allegedly walked and went across the creek there, Bluff Creek. So in the last frames of the footage that was shot, you see her walking away, and how wide of a creature it is, if it is a creature or whatever it is, extremely wide and fluid, the movements, and even possibility of some of the hair being like when a cat or a dog gets irritated. I don't remember the term, if it's a razorback or something like that. They get a little bit of like the goosebumps, kind of, their hair jumps up. Maybe some of that on there. I mean, that could be just completely artifacts added from all the different film copies, but look for those ending frames, because that is rarely ever looked at, the walking away, and it's incredible how wide this thing was, whatever it was. So it's a extremely fascinating footage, and so many people have looked into it, and people like Bill Munns have done so much great work on it, and it's hard to argue with some of the stuff. I've even have a friend down in Florida who is a camera guy, and he had a lot of interesting kind of notes about, why is it that Roger knew about the focus? He had practiced, he must have practiced, and there was all these kind of red flags he had in his mind, and he got to talk to Bill Munns about it. But so many people have looked at that have that sort of professional skill set, that maybe they work with cameras, or they know what they're talking about, costume people, all this sort of stuff. And there's a variety of opinions, of course, but I think if you're more informed about the circumstances around it, you can, kind of look at that and sort of judge for yourself. But it's supremely fascinating, and what a beautiful place it is too. And we experienced some weird activity ourselves at Bluff Creek. So,
did you?
Well,
yeah, we had some, what I would consider, and I can't verify or confirm this, of course, possible whoop that I heard while we were staying at the infamous Louse camp, which is one of the old logging camps that was used originally by Tom Slick in the Bigfoot expedition in the late 1950s, after the tracks were found there, with John Green and others being involved in that expedition. And we heard this kind of strange whoop-like noise after my friend's dog was acting very strangely, and the most scared I've ever seen a dog. And it was just a whole kind of, it's in one of our videos, Bigfoot at Bluff Creek, the whole incident, because it was just sort of unusual. I thought it was a human making the whoop, but I was able to confirm it wasn't anyone at camp, and none of the dogs or anything that were there. So it was a very unusual kind of thing. And again, I can't verify that, but it was just sort of suspicious, we'll put it that way. That amongst some other things, but it's a beautiful place. I mean, it's still rugged, raw wilderness out there in Bluff Creek.
And one last thing I'll say about the Patterson Gimlin film tape is, not many people back then, if it was a hoax, would think about putting breasts on the suit. Now that's something that I've actually spoken to Bill Munns about, and he went, yeah, it's something that doesn't really come up, and
very strange.
It's just something called that possibly, and for her size to be around about 6 foot point something,
Right.
6'7" something. I'm like, or yeah, it's just something.
Yeah, Cliff Barrickman has an interesting display in his museum in Oregon, the North American Bigfoot Center, where they took some of the copies of the casts of Patty and tried to make an estimation of how big the creature would have been by taking that foot, trying to kind of measure it. And they also come around 6'3", 6 something. I don't remember exactly. But playing devil's advocate, I will say Roger Patterson, in his book that he wrote previously in the previous years to Patty, did draw a Sasquatch with breasts. But apparently he was referring to a very famous sighting that I actually recently just researched from the, I believe it was the late 1950s or early 1950s, maybe it was 1951. It was the William Rowe encounter, which happened in the Rocky Mountains of British Columbia, which is a very well-known encounter in which a hunter had a long duration kind of observation of a female Sasquatch apparently eating, and the way he described it. And what I found interesting was while I was in British Columbia, I interviewed a researcher who talked, to Dr. John Bindernagel, who talked about the William Rowe encounter, and had actually met a biologist who used to work with this William Rowe guy and said, oh, wow, we used to, as biologists, we would listen to observations from William Rowe talking about prairie antelope in Alberta and in other parts of Canada. And they said, hey, we would always look forward to his descriptions because they were always so incredibly detailed and spot on in terms of what the animals were doing and their behavioral patterns. So to think this guy would have made up this really long duration Bigfoot encounter to the detail he did is interesting. And supposedly Patterson referenced that William Rowe sighting in one of his books. Now, again, that being said, could be a coincidence, right? But the way that creature looks, especially in some of those composites, I mean, the movement of those muscles in the breast, it just, I don't know how they would have done it in 1967. I think that in itself is a mystery unto itself. How create such a suit that still has not been replicated to that level, right? People have tried, but it's very interesting. There's been attempts that have failed miserably. I mean, it's just very, very interesting. So something happened there. I don't know what it is, but
so there's a few things that you've just said, Alex. One thing, this Patty is the same sort of height as me, and when I watch this video, you get the impression of something a lot heavier and bigger and longer strides than me. You see the rate at which she goes past the rocks, which you've got a feeling of some sort of idea of the size, or a rough idea. So as Daniel said, when they digitized the footage and you can see the hackles going up, you called it the razorback, or I mean that nailed it for me. And then what you've just said there, that's a long way to carry a fake suit.
Yeah,
on horseback, nonetheless. I mean, again, the area is so rugged, and it would have been. I mean, it's still as rugged as it hasn't changed much. I mean, realistically, it would have been a little more logged at the time because this was, within 10 years of when the logging first started, when they first started punching roads into this wilderness. So now they don't log out there as much. They still do. There was a recent forest fire a couple months ago that almost took out the whole Patterson Gimlin site. Big forest fires all through Northern California. But the area is so wild. Again, you could have had the same visual effect if you had just gone a couple miles outside of town. I don't, the location itself, obviously, aside from the history there, you could have picked a much easier place to go to. If what the circumstances around that were true, and I think a lot of people that were involved at the time confirmed that yes, they were actually at Bluff Creek. They did come out with the footage to get it processed, but they were actually there, and we know they are because those guys that rediscovered the film site after it was lost, they were able to look at it, and I was shown this with my own eyes, which is incredible. They have stumps and trees that are still there from the footage, and it's been a long time, obviously 60 plus years. So entire trees have grown within where that footage was taken. So I believe it was 1963 or 64, there was a big flood that took out a lot of Northern California. That's why it created that environment where Patty walked with that sort of silt that was deposited from the flood, and it cleared a lot of the stuff that was there. But so in where that happened, a lot has grown in. But those guys are able to show me multiple points that are exactly the same, stumps that are still rotting, trees that are still there. They have one called the pool cue, one called Smiley, and it's a stump that almost looks like it has a smile on it. It's so interesting. So it confirms that is absolutely the place where the footage was taken. So it's you can't dispute that because that's where it happened. Obviously, the dispute is as to what it was, but. I mean, it's a beautiful area. I would love to go back to Bluff Creek. I have friends that go every year. It's kind of their yearly journey into the mountains, and that area has produced a lot of sightings and a lot of stories and other weird noises. We've had our kind of encounter. My friend recorded a strange Scream out there the year prior to us going. So there's a history of stuff out there, or whatever's going on. I can't claim to know what it is, but it's a beautiful place to get out to regardless.
And it's probably one of the biggest mysteries in cryptid, in cryptozoology, and it's probably one of the biggest. Now, Alex, we've been talking for an hour and 5 minutes, and
already?
it's gone so fast. Honestly,
We're just talking about Loch Ness 5 minutes ago.
Exactly. Yeah.
We are definitely gonna have to do another interview at some point. I've got 7 questions that we still haven't answered. We've answered 3 questions on my sheet. Honestly,
That's awesome.
honestly, we haven't answered a lot of them. But
You haven't mentioned my sheet yet.
Yeah.
I haven't even started.
No, we'll definitely have to. I mean, the big cat topic, of course, is so
yeah.
fascinating. So we'll have to get on that too.
But thank you so much, Alex, and thank you to everyone who has watched. I'm sure Alex will be happy to answer any of your questions if you just shove it in the comments, and I'm sure he'll answer. But thank you so much to Alex and Chris.
Thank you.
And guys, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube and our podcast. And this podcast should be out very, very soon. But thank you from all of us, and keep searching and stay mythical. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
Thank you for listening to the Mythical Legends podcast. For more information, check out our Facebook group. The truth is out there.